yeah, maybe we can start with a little check-in, like to say how are we today, and after that we can enter into the discussion. So somebody wants to start? How is the summer going?
I can start if you want. Summer's going okay. I am defending my dissertation this afternoon, so it's a little while.
Wow! Congratulations! I mean, how do you feel with all of with that?
I'm anxious, but I think it'll be okay. It's just been a lot. Like yesterday, somebody said they were going to drop out, and I was like, you can't drop out. Like I need the full committee. So it's been a lot of emails and chaos. We found us another person, so it's going to be okay.
Oof,
but yeah, but I'm excited for it to be done. It's been a long road.
Nice, very good. How are you, Luigi Walabania?
Yeah, I'm okay. I think I spent quite a bit of the last month looking for places to live, just because I have to move at the end of July, and so it's been a little stressful. But for the most part, I did make some progress on research. I've been attending these meetings, and I also started to teach last week. So I think it's getting busier, and this weekend maybe like my only stay free like weekend sort of. But I'm glad it's 4th of July. I'll get to see some fireworks and all of that. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah. Nice. Lumijiwa, how are you? Are you there? Yeah, I think he's not. On my side, I've been good. I've been working a lot in my dissertation, trying to have my proposal accepted. And I started to do also a little bit of work related with the things I want to do. And it was very funny because part of my study, my dissertation is like a study about tweets of people speaking about a test using Chile. So that is kind of like check on what people are speaking and then continue with further research from what people say. And as I was reading the tweets, I started to realize that Twitter can be fun. And I never was like very into Twitter, but I think there was like a day in which I was like so hooked on the thing. And I hate that because I don't like Twitter in general, but yeah, I kind of like, I had a little bit of the sensation of like enjoying Twitter. So yeah. All right. So about the chapter 13. What do you think about the chapter? We're not that many today, so we can just speak about our impressions.
I'm just looking at it right now. I feel like they focus on program evaluation, policy studies, and accountability systems. So I think this is where, when you design a test or something, you can actually have impact on the real world because you could influence policy and things like that. So it is important. What else? I'm not trying to get into specifics because I didn't go through each and every point, but yeah, that's like the key thing for me that, you could actually bring about change.
Actually, overall, compared to most of the other chapters, I have a little bit less criticism because I think people who do program evaluations, I've been part of a few, tend to be a little bit less methodological or can be. And so I thought this was actually like a really helpful set of guidelines because definitely some of the evaluations I've been part of, they design their own instruments, they design their own tests, they design their own measures, very little validity evidence, if any, was collected. They didn't do any kind of psychometric analyses. I tried to push that, like, let's do at least something. And they were like, no, we don't need to. Everyone's taking this survey. And so I think overall, like, because they're a little more like in the world, I think a set of guidelines is really helpful. And I don't think most of these things are done consistently across a lot of program evaluations.
Yeah. Any other comment, reaction to the chapter in general? As I was reading the chapter, I mean, yeah, in general, I think I struggle with the how easy the standards and quote the field accepts whatever decision maker wants to do. Like that part, I never have felt comfortable with that. I remember I took a class in the anthropology department at UMass Amherst, and in one of the classes that we had, it was like a class specific on community-based research. There was one class in which we studied ethics of community-based research. And anthropologists, they have had like a big deal on quote misuse of their methodologies, because for example during World War II, I think some anthropologists were used as spies, for example, and they were used to kind of like in the pretext of like doing research, they were sent to some communities to understand them better, but then to have like a military use of the information. And they had to like think very carefully about ethics of their profession in that regard, in which in the sense of how they, in the exercise of their profession, how their what are the expectations for a professional regarding the person that is basically paying for the research and with the communities that they are researching. There was a case of one anthropologist that actually he was doing a study in Chile, my country actually, and it was like it was with indigenous people and some how do you say that, like a dam, like these hydroelectrical projects that they kind of like flood a big area. And he wanted to kind of understand what would be the impact of doing that project with some indigenous community. The land was from them, and there was a controversy because he shared the results of his research with the community, and the institution that was like doing the mandate of the research, which was the World Bank, they complained. They didn't want the results of the research to be shared with the community. But the anthropologist that did their work, he felt that it was inappropriate to do that. And actually there was like a case, and at the end it was ruled out that the professional was right in his criteria to put the interest of the community first to the person that was mandating the study, because the research was important for the community. So I like a lot that spirit, and I think in testing we haven't been thinking about these topics, and we are very good at ignoring them, because many times we are in that conflict of what's the best for the communities that are being assessed, and what's the best interest of the person that is mandating for the test. And I believe that there are many cases in which, ethically speaking, we should commit first to the communities, not to the mandate, to the person that is paying, basically. But that's a complicated position right now in our field to defend, because we are very used and very accustomed to just put the mandate first. So on this whole chapter, it's like, yeah, I mean, it's nice to have this guidance that you say, Maggie, yeah, great. But still, there is no agency of the takers, there is no agency of schools, and the chapter is completely okay with that. Fine.
Yeah, hello everybody. I think the same about you. It's the same idea. Usually the purpose of the assessment is dictated by OECD or World Bank or the government, but especially in the large scale, dictate how parameters or what kind of attributes or domains we need to assess. But no, sometimes that domains are not relevant for the teachers or principals or people that really use the assessments. So this is a kind of factor that affect the use of the assessment in the schools, because okay, maybe it's important for the World Bank, but not for my community. So I don't know how to use that. I don't know why it's important to assess critical thinking. Yes, I know, but I have a problem of poverty or aggression here that I need to assess more or work more with empathy or trauma in countries or regions that have very violent past or activity in their communities. So sometimes it's difficult to sustain and get a purpose and assessment and use of the assessment results, because that doesn't respond to the values and the reality of the communities, but responds more for international or economic interests. So it's difficult to respond to that. But is that we need to point out what think teachers about this assessment is relevant for this state or this excuse me, district. Assess that kind of thing. Yeah, not only in the United States, but also in Latin America, because I'm from Colombia, and that happens in Colombia a lot. That I don't use that kind of assessment because I don't know why you invest on that. I can't put my students' response the test, but this is for you, not for me. This is the answer of the teacher. So yes, I agree with you. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's tricky. I think it's tricky to the role that a psychometrician or an expert in educational measurement plays, because it's kind of in between the institution that originated the test, or most of the time, particularly in the case of policy evaluation and accountability. That in that case, usually it's not the community themselves that they are looking for, it's some external institution or group. And you're in between, like the communities that are taking the test and the institution that wants something from them. And what's the well, first, what's ethical in that context in terms of the exercise of the profession? And then also what's the best practice, or what's the recommendation from if there is a consensus about what to do in certain cases? In my opinion, in very personal opinion, I think to the very least we should be able to document resistance from the communities, and to document values from the communities, and to document like when there is like a mismatch, to write about it. Not necessarily take action about it, but definitely make it visible and kind of make everybody aware of this problem. And this entails a lot with the discussions about whether, for example, politics should be or not separated from testing, about what's the role of values of whom, like the test developer, the mandate, the community, so many levels. Yeah, I don't know, that's at least my opinion, but definitely there hasn't been not even a conversation. And also I wonder if this should be like part of a code of ethics, because in anthropology that was a conversation more about ethics. So maybe it's not the standard, the place in which such a thing should be, but I don't know, it's at least a topic I think it should be discussed.
And I think in general with like program evaluations, but also broadly, like having been a teacher, having people externally coming into the classroom, there's always a feeling of, why are you here? And is it here to like help me? Or is it here to like try to catch me? And there was a lot of sense of like, and also going into classrooms, it was a sense of like, well, why are you watching? Why are you observing me teach? Like, why do you need this data for my students? And a lot of times going into classrooms in my own classroom, it's like, there's always a sense from teachers and for myself too, that, you know, perhaps the data they're collecting is to show them a bad teacher or to like do something for my kids in a way where it's like punishing them or giving them less services or taking more funding away because they don't deserve money, quote unquote. And there's a lot of that sense too. And in the past too, these sort of larger standardized tests have also been used to reallocate funding, and kids who score lower, those districts and those schools actually get even less money instead of giving them more money and more support. So it's really complicated, the intersection of all these different external stakeholders and then the local people.
Particularly when tests are used for punishment. That I think that particular use is, I mean, that should be that thing. In those type of uses, it doesn't make sense to me that we are okay with using a test for enforce a system of power that actually might be considered oppression if the communities are not agreeing with those enforcements. So I mean, I don't know. I think in those specific cases is where you actually should be very aware of about how politics are influencing all of this. And well, and actually that might be like a weak response actually, because if you think more from Jennifer Randall's point of view, it's not just about like making people aware, it's like taking action against structure of oppression. Yeah, I mean, that actually might be the real ethical thing to do. Yeah. Any other comment, reaction?
Just listening to everything that y'all are discussing, and so those are all like long-term change, right? If you want to affect like the political underpinnings of what's driving your policy evaluation and things like that. So what would be something like short-term that we can do, you know, that anyone can do actually to like better the process or make it at least a little bit better? I don't know, I'm not saying it right, but I hope you get my point. I think doing those things, like irrespective of whether your long-term initiatives have an effect or not, and you know, it's not helping you in any way. If you start something, it's going to help probably like someone in your place like 5 years later, right? So what would be something that we could do like today? It would be more of my thought. Yeah.
I think that is super connected with the assessment or the evaluation of the consequences of use of testing or assessment, where we can include different sources of the effects of the using testing. So but it's very rare the cases that programs doing that kind of thing, but we can't propose in the standards that when we report the results and the interpretation of the scores is not the last step of the assessment. But always they said validation is a continuing process, but the continuing process now is validate technically the test again and again and again in different times. Is also assess the consequences. And there are a lot of examples of people that collect information from different sources, not only quantitative methodologies, to assess that kind of consequences in teachers, principals, families, communities, districts. yes, even people that spend money to sell testing, because we are all involved in that, but it's not the usual practice. And we have different cultures and communities in the United States that responds differently of the test. There are a lot of people that are, I don't know, in comfort with the system, but others no. And we usually, because it's a very standardized and general point of view, we center the point in that communities that present a well fit in the model, but no in the other communities because there are very, I don't know, separate or minorities. So it's important to be more quotidian and used to the assessment of the use of consequences. I know there is a lot of discussion. This is part of no validity, but regardless to that, a theoretical problem is necessary to do it for us and be aware about that process exists and teach us as a graduate students and undergraduate students that is part of the process of the create and validate a test in whatever situation is.
I think, yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, maybe there is a discussion on test validity, if consequences, what's the role of study of consequences on the validity of a test, and the validity of an interpretation, the validity of uses. But definitely when you think about a policy, which is not exactly a test, but it's like an intervention that you want to do and so on. I mean, obviously you need to take care about consequences. If for tests, then maybe there is a debate, but for policies, absolutely there is no debate. That should be because it's, I mean, when you are doing a policy in that type of level, that's part of the evaluation process of the policy, that you have some expected consequences, you may have some unintended things. And yeah, I mean, I can see that to respond to Lavanya, that actually is a very effective step to kind of change things right now and don't wait like too long for a long-term change. Another thing that it was surprising for me, I didn't know because I haven't read the chapter before. It was the role of motivation that appears in many moments in the chapter. And I think that sounds like an easy thing to do in terms of the standard already say that there is certain recommendation on student motivation. So, and at least the programs that I know, they don't study that, they don't enter on that, they don't do research on that. And that's actually something that might be very like short term in terms of like asking that programs abide to the standards in this regard in particular. Because when you study motivation and what's the impact, first, what's the evidence of the assumptions related with motivation associated with the use of a test for accountability purposes, for example, that is supposed to generate certain externality in society. Back that. I mean, what's the evidence of, for example, that including a whole accountability system actually is beneficial for a system or not? If you are assuming that the accountability system creates certain incentives, show me evidence that actually that's happening. That is very related with motivation at the end, in many levels. In one part of the chapter, I think they speak about motivation more about engagement, in the sense of how the interpretation of a score coming from a test in which people just don't care about it and they respond whatever. I mean, obviously that's a problem, but that kind of like the tip of the iceberg of a whole explanation of why people just don't care to respond to your test. So if a community doesn't want to respond to the test, of course they are just going to sabotage you. And kind of maybe you can interpret that the level in which people respond to the test in an engaged way it's a proxy of how the communities actually agree with the purpose of the test in general, at least the test takers. So yeah, I think one other thing on top of like consequences could be like to be more careful with motivation, like be more precise on that type of research when you are doing assumptions about motivation, and in general check what's happening in that level with test use for policy.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding this right, with both Sandra's and like your discussion here. So it's like when you want to ensure that the validation process is ongoing and not just done once in like 10 years, you want to make sure that the people who are conducting the validation, or like, you know, your test, those are not test takers. Those are like, I think what the standards call as test users. You want to make sure that they are held accountable, right? So I'm just thinking along those lines in terms, all your points play to that as well. Apart from the test takers part is like, you know, when you're doing the validation process, you're collecting data from them. So that's their side of the story. But what about test users? How would you ensure that the accountability systems actually hold them accountable? Like if you say incentives are not working, then what would work? What would be some motivation for them to like, you know, ensure that they're actually doing what they're supposed to do in their job? I don't know if this is like a tangent, but I was just trying to understand what are, you know, who is the target test personnel that we're speaking about?
Can you repeat the last part? Who's the target? What?
Test personnel, like are they the test users or the people who are applying for the test? Because yeah, ensure that the validation process is ongoing. I think it's like that's the responsibility of, let's say, the test users, not the test takers, like people who develop the test, people who conduct the validation studies and things like that.
Well, I think in general, the matter of who is responsible for what is a big thing on the standards across all chapters. And in practice, you see a lot of responsibility diffusion. Like, because there are so many people that are involved, sometimes that actually is counterproductive because everybody says, no, the other is actually the one that should be doing this. I mean, maybe the session we had with Mari Govan from University of California, that was a session about the rights and responsibilities of test users. And in that session, in that conversation, yeah, we had it was very interesting to see, for example, how University of California, they decided about the SIT and the ACT and the use of standardized tests for their admission process. And there were like so many pieces on it. And actually not even as a quote user, it was clear who was the exact people as user, because they had like an admission office, they have the academic senate that was taking decisions, they had like other like members within there as an institution, and between them actually they're kind of like pointing each other like, no, you should be doing this or that. And I think in particularly for this chapter, that problem is even more big. Actually, in many, if I remember well, in many of the standards, they say the test developer and the user. Let me look for one example just to be sure about this. So for example, standard 13.8, those who mandate the use of tests in policy, evaluation, and accountability context, and those who use tests in such context should monitor their impact and should identify and minimize negative consequences. Right. So you have two people that were assigned to that thing. So it's both one of them. I mean, those kind of like imprecisions actually are pretty problematic in practice, because at the end you don't know who exactly are you should be kind of like putting in responsibility. The standard is saying both, so yeah, maybe that's enough. But yeah, in general, I would say that, and also considering that test takers are not even included in the whole story. So if you include them, you maybe include even more of this problem of responsibility diffusion. Yeah. But yeah, it's tricky. And I think in general, it will be a lot of value if the standard will be a bit more precise in some stuff. The standard, I think, in general, have enough precision in certain big important topics, but yeah, I mean, that's yeah. In practice, I've seen many times this problem of like people passing the balls to other.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. Those are good points. I do remember that talk about the University of California and how things went. Going to be so much opposition to a small change, and yeah, the process itself is like so complicated that it can take ages for you even to make that small change.
Ooh, another thing that it was surprising for me was in, I think it's the second page. They say that, 1 second. And therefore, it is often necessary for those who conduct such studies to rely on measures developed for other purposes. So yeah, that was kind of surprising for me a bit. That, I mean, they later say that you should be careful about the purpose of the test, but it still is kind of like leaving the door slightly open to kind of like use as any test. And yeah, that was surprising a little bit to read that, because I find it contradictory, because if you are during this along the standards, it's very clear this idea of like being aware of the purposes, to being aware of the uses, and but also then later coming back and saying, yeah, well, sometimes you can't do it anyway. So
Where was this again?
I think it's in the second page of the chapter. Let me 1 second. Let me give you the exact page. I think it's page 204. It's like at the end of the first column and the beginning of the second column.
Yeah, I can speak at least from the IO psychology area. All the validation literature that we study, and even in relation to practice, whatever I learned so far, it has been like emphasized so much everywhere. Like you see, this is the ARE, right? And I mentioned PSYOP principles are like a version of this for the IO psychology test specifically. Is that you have to document every bit of thing, right? So be thorough, document everything, and as long as you do that, you're at least covered in part. And you can, and that's also a way to ensure that the test professionals are doing what they're supposed to do, because you're telling them that this can come back later for litigation, so you have to be ready to have answers on what you've done and why you've done it, especially with respect to content validation. I think they suggest to document everything. And of course, if you're using like the validation information from elsewhere, then it means that, you know, you have to show that there's job relatedness from that job to this job, and that's why you're using the same test, and that you can't conduct a local study here.
Yeah, it is interesting actually, the contrast with other type of testing, because I think, for example, for accountability, for policy stuff, the inferences are made usually about communities, about groups of people, but not necessarily about individuals. So when it comes to individuals, it's very clear, like the type of rights and the type of like red lines that you cannot cross. But when it comes to a community, I mean, in theory, you could like translate the same rights from an individual to a communal level, but maybe that translation is not that clear sometimes. So, for example, if an accountability test says something about a school, the evidence behind that interpretation is less back maybe than the same situation when you are actually doing interpretation of a person.
Yeah, that translation is not clear, and it's not exactly simple either. That's probably one of the reasons why it's not clear, because it's, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how the standards are addressing that, and how, you know, we could address it better. And
I mean, here maybe I will be a little bit political, but I can see that in general, we are living in a society, economical system that is very individualistic, and it systematically refuses to like take communities as an entity, to recognize them. So yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, it makes sense actually that, and well, that's an interesting thing. Maybe it's not well connected maybe in standards, because there is a lot of literature of people that are criticizing the role of testing in neoliberal projects. And that's I mean, if that's a problem, that's a political problem. And it's a political problem for some people, because it can be people that actually support neoliberal projects, because it's a political thing. Yeah, and in this chapter, I don't think, yeah, that's interesting. In the chapter, there's no trace of the origins of why somebody would need to do accountability, or what motivates in the first place. The policies, it's agnostic to that. And yeah, that continues like a tradition maybe in testing, of like kind of ignoring that the political part. But actually society, that's the type of things that are complaining about testing. I mean, think that 2019, Amy Stewart, I think is the name, of president of ARA, that she in her presidential address, she actually criticized standardized testing used for accountability. And she did a very like hard criticism on us. I would say on us, because maybe we should consider ourselves a part of the field in that area. That she compares like the situation of standard testing with the oil industry, basically. That there was a whole industry that is kind of like having a negative impact on the planet. So standard testing is kind of doing something similar in terms of defending themselves and defending a business that actually ends to be negative, have a negative impact overall. And yeah, I mean, there is on one side if in theory, if you investigate consequences, then you should become aware of any problem that is coming, and that in general, I would say, is part of what is expected in the standards and what's part of the consensus. But on the other side, there is a more political criticism in terms of basically the exploitative nature of testing when it's used in this way, and actually how money relates with having more and more tests that are literally like drilling data. And it's very similar actually to the metaphor, the comparison that Amy Stewart did. I think it's appropriate in the sense that sometimes it can happen that a test become exploitative in the sense that you are kind of like getting money from the point of view of a test developer. You are getting money for using a test to like bring information from people, even if that is against the best interest of that community. So yeah, but as is part of a more political thing, then it's tricky to say, yeah, when you're actually crossing the line in terms of a scientific endeavor, and what's the relationship of science or whatever we do in scientific terms with the political aspects or consequences that happen in the things we do. So yeah, that's very tricky.
Suddenly it sounded like we live in a really dark world. But that's okay. I mean, I still think we're not that bad yet. And this is all part of the process, right? Like we have ideas and we're gonna present them to people who actually can make a change. So I think these are all like great points to discuss and put in our report.
Any other comment, reaction? No, I think we're good. So maybe we can spend the last 10 minutes to write questions to the expert. The expert for this chapter is going to be Laura Hamilton. She's from ETS. And she has worked a lot on program evaluation, the type of stuff this chapter. So maybe we can write some questions right now.
Do we have a link to the board, Sergio? I think I have the one for I think we have
Yes.
the link for the one for
yeah,
that was
yeah.
yesterday, but
I
not
just shared in the chat. Sorry. Okay, I think we are close to the time now. But yeah, you can continue like writing questions if you want to put in text. Nice to see you, everybody.
Thank you. Nice to
Thank
see you.
you.
Nice to see you too.
Bye bye.